Jerome Hayes stood still in the Detroit subway station as the train's screeching whistle sliced through the air. And in that instant, the 12-year-old boy understood that this world would never spare anyone who wasn't strong enough to survive. The shouts from the streets above, the distant wail of police sirens, and the ragged breaths of his mother coming off her third shift blended into a bleak soundtrack of the childhood he was forced to grow up inside. But what no one ever saw, especially those who called him the kid who would never amount to anything, was the look in Jerome's eyes, where fear was sharpening into something far more dangerous. He didn't just observe the world, he analyzed it, dissected it, understood it in a way no one his age could. The crumbling buildings, the rusted fire escapes, the trash-clogged corners, all of it became data streaming through his mind, forming patterns he didn't yet realize would become the foundation of an algorithm that would one day transform the aviation industry. But before he became the man capable of bringing down an entire airline with a single phone call, Jerome was a skinny kid who had to run fast every afternoon after school just to avoid the street gangs. His mother, Linda Hayes, was a tiny woman, but stronger than any metal that could be forged in a steel mill. She worked at a laundromat from 5 in the morning, cleaned houses at noon, and served tables late into the night. She slept 4 hours a day, but every time she looked at her son, her eyes lit up, as if trying to push him further than the life she had lived. "You have to get out of here, Jerome," she always said, placing her calloused but warm hand on his cheek. "You have a mind that cannot be wasted in this place." And Jerome listened. Jerome understood. But the world did not easily allow a poor black child to believe in a bright future. At school, when he answered every question correctly on the advanced math test, the teacher looked at him with suspicion and condescension. "You sure you didn't cheat, Hayes?" Light question that cut like a blade. His classmates laughed whenever he read books about economics during recess. Fake Einstein, sit down. Poor kids don't get to act smart. But the moment he stepped into the Detroit Public Library, where the smell of old paper mixed with the hum of a tired air conditioner, Jerome felt the world stretch thousands of kilometers wider. There he learned about stocks, about markets, about the movement of money. He saved his earnings from delivering newspapers to buy his first 3 shares. Those rain-soaked newspapers, his freezing hands every dawn, and his sprinting through dark streets eventually earned him $47. A tiny number to the world. A universe to Jerome. When Jerome turned 14, a night fell over Detroit with a complete blackout. Every house drowned in darkness, only the chaos of shouting down the street, cutting through the night. His mother still wasn't home, and he sat in a room lit only by a flickering candle. He opened his worn notebook and wrote numbers one by one. He didn't know he was sketching the earliest lines of the aircraft optimization algorithm the entire industry would one day study. In the dark, he thought, "One day I will get out of here. I have to." That night, he made a promise that would stay with him for life. At 16, one of the saddest twists of his life hit. His mother was caught in a late-night shootout between 2 gangs on her way home. They hadn't targeted her, but bullets don't care who is innocent. She survived, but she could never work the same brutal jobs again. Jerome watched her trembling hands, saw her collapse for the first time, and felt his heart break. But in that pain, he discovered a kind of strength. No one could see the strength to turn suffering into fuel. That same year, Jerome received a full scholarship to an elite boarding school in Massachusetts. When he boarded the bus leaving Detroit, Neighbors stared with uncertain eyes, some sympathetic, some doubtful, some jealous. But Jerome felt only one thing: this was the first time he was stepping out of the life that had been assigned to him. At the new school, Jerome immediately saw he was unlike anyone else there. Perfect uniforms, polished shoes, kids talking about European vacations and weekend golf trips. Jerome had an old backpack, worn-down shoes, and the awareness that he had to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. Even when he answered every question fluently in economics class, some teachers still frowned. His classmates whispered behind his back, but no one knew that every night Jerome sat under his dorm desk lamp, reading 5 more chapters. No one knew he recorded market fluctuations for an entire year, as if he were decoding a cosmic secret. No one knew the boy they dismissed was becoming a true prodigy. One winter evening, after earning an A+ on an essay, Jerome overheard 2 classmates whispering behind the room. He probably didn't even write it. People like him are just lucky to be here. The words tightened Jerome's chest, but they no longer pierced him. He had grown used to being doubted. He looked out the window at snowflakes falling under the bright campus lights, and then he smiled. If they thought he couldn't do it, they were about to prove themselves wrong. What they didn't know was that the kid from Detroit didn't just want to rise. He wanted to change the game. And he would. Not for anyone else, but for himself, and for the mother who always believed he could reach the sky. Jerome Hayes, once dismissed because of poverty, skin color, and origin, was preparing for a life none of them could imagine. A life where he would not only escape Detroit, he would rise to become the man who could make an entire airline pay within 5 minutes. But they didn't know that. Not yet. And that was their greatest mistake. Jerome Hayes walked through the gates of Andover boarding school, like someone stepping into a world that did not belong to him, and every sense in his body knew it instantly. The winter wind slashed against his skin like sharp knives, but the cold he felt did not come from the weather. It came from the eyes. Curious eyes, judgmental eyes, surprised eyes, cautious eyes. Eyes that said, "How did you get in here?" Andover was beautiful, like a classical painting. Red brick walls dusted with white snowstone pathways, a 2-story library with heavy wooden doors. Its elegance was undeniable, but it radiated the coldness of exclusion, a cold Jerome felt more sharply than any gust of wind swirling around him. The first orientation meeting for new students took place in the grand hall. Voices layered over each other, laughter conversations, and the rustling of expensive jackets blended into a rhythm that felt like another world. Jerome sat in the middle row, quietly observing. The kids around him talked about vacations in Vermont, a gala from the previous weekend, or summer internships already arranged by their families. Jerome thought of his mother back home, her leg still aching from last year's shooting, but who still forced herself up that morning to prepare his old scarf. At first, Jerome believed that if he worked hard enough, wealth or status or background wouldn't matter. But less than 1 week into school, he understood that effort was only the first step in a long war. In advanced math class, when Jerome solved the hardest problem on the board in exactly 4 minutes, Mr. Wallace frowned, not out of admiration. "You sure you didn't look at the answer key, Hayes?" He asked, his voice calm, but his eyes full of suspicion. Soft laughter bubbled up from the row behind him. Jerome said nothing, not because he didn't know how to respond, but because at that moment he realized something for the first time. Sometimes being excellent didn't earn people's respect. It made them doubt him even more. The price of exceeding their expectations was resistance. But that was only the beginning. What truly taught Jerome that life was far from fair came during a study group meeting. In the dorm room, two boys, Connor and Blake, whispered, thinking Jerome couldn't hear. "He only got accepted because the school needs to fill the quota," Blake said. "Yeah, with a file like that, no way he'd get in." "If I were him, I'd feel embarrassed," Connor added. Jerome stood outside his hand, resting on the freezing doorknob. Those words didn't surprise him, but they carved themselves deeper. A reminder that no matter how smart he was, no matter how hard he worked in their eyes, he would always start from a lower place. And in that moment, something inside Jerome, a wire stretched tight for years, didn't snap but turned into steel. He walked into the room as if he had heard nothing but his eyes, cold, steady, fully aware, silenced them instantly. That night, Jerome sat in Andover's library, warm yellow light falling on pages of macroeconomics and risk analysis. Most students had already gone back to their dorms. Only a few remained, typing softly on their laptops. Jerome set his book down and looked through the thick glass, fogged by cold air outside. Snow fell in quiet, pure white sheets. "No one believes I belong here," he whispered to himself. "So I'll make sure they cannot deny it." A thought flashed in his mind, a thought the aviation world would one day recognize, without ever knowing where it began. If the world doesn't open its doors, then I'll build a new world. But isolation wasn't the only thing Jerome faced. In the second month, the school hosted a special seminar. Jerome was assigned to present a market valuation model, a report he had spent 3 full weeks preparing. When he stepped onto the stage, soft laughter rippled through the audience. "Let's see how many words he can pronounce," someone whispered. Jerome froze for a second, then began. His voice didn't shake. His data was precise, his arguments sharp, his charts flawless. And when he spoke the final sentence, the room fell silent. Not applause, not outrage, just stunned quiet. No one had expected that level of brilliance, that quiet, that shock became the moment Jerome realized he had just won a small battle. But the real war was still ahead. In the spring, Jerome received monumental news. He was invited to interview for a prestigious scholarship from a major private foundation in Boston, a scholarship that could lead him straight to Harvard. As he left for the interview, the career counselor offered a hesitant, half-sympathetic comment. "Jerome, this is a good opportunity, but don't set your expectations too high. Scholarships like this usually go to families with stronger backgrounds." Jerome nodded politely, but inside his answer was different. "That is exactly why I must win it." 3 weeks later, when Jerome opened the email and the word "congratulations" appeared, he sat completely still. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply fell silent. A silence where the entire universe seemed to fold itself into a single moment. And he knew this wasn't just an opportunity. It was the ticket that would carry him out of the box others had placed him in. A ticket that opened the path to Harvard, to founding Skylink Air, to the day he would push Pacific Air into crisis. But in that moment, Jerome thought of only one thing: how proud his mother would be. He couldn't know that one day when he stepped into first class and was ordered back to economy, the people who looked down on him would soon learn they had picked the wrong man. And the price they would pay would not be cheap. The train rushed through Boston at sunset, painting the sky in a blaze of orange and red, and inside that quiet cabin, an older Jerome Hayes leaned back in his seat, his eyes still and deep like a lake before a storm. The 18-year-old young man, once the boy dismissed in Detroit and doubted in Andover, was now holding an acceptance letter from Harvard, stamped with a crimson seal, a confirmation that he had stepped into a sky he once only dared to admire from afar. Harvard was vast, beautiful, and strange. Its old buildings felt like they carried the breath of an entire century, every stairway and every brick telling stories of the people who had once changed America. But in that same space, Jerome understood that he was once again starting from the lowest position in other people's minds. On the first day as he walked into macroeconomics, several students' expressions shifted from curiosity to judgment, then settled into something unimpressed. Simple clothes, a slightly worn backpack, and silence, three things that made it easy for others to box him in as a scholarship kid from a poor neighborhood who was probably more lucky than talented. But they were about to learn how wrong they were, and the lesson would not be gentle. The first exam was returned after 3 weeks. The room fell silent when the professor set an A+ on Jerome's desk. A student behind him whispered, "No way." The professor stared at Jerome a little longer than necessary before saying, "You have a different way of observing. Keep it." But that was only the beginning. One winter night, while wind howled against the dorm windows, Jerome sat in the only lit room on the 3rd floor. In front of him were statistics, tables, mathematical models, and stock charts beating like the pulse of the global economy. He was writing a paper for data science, an assignment requiring a model to predict fuel prices in the transportation industry. Most students chose the easy route, a linear model and a few stable variables. Jerome was different. He didn't want to predict a number, he wanted to predict an entire landscape. He built a multi-layered algorithm, simulating global oil market shifts, airline reactions, seasonal patterns, and dozens of seemingly unrelated factors that in truth were deeply interconnected. When he submitted his paper, the professor stared at him for a long moment before saying, "If this model works in the real world, you will change an entire industry." Those words would follow Jerome for years, but when he heard them, he only bowed his head, partly because that was his nature, and partly because he knew praise would not protect him from what lay ahead. Despite his talent, Harvard was far from a paradise. There was no shortage of people who wanted to remind Jerome that no matter how gifted he was, he would always be an outsider in their world. One evening during a group discussion on business strategy, Jerome suggested expanding operations through optimized flight routing. Evan, a student from a wealthy Connecticut family, laughed. "You mean cutting costs with some random algorithm you made up?" "Jerome, people like you usually don't understand how big companies actually work." The words hit Jerome's pride harder than any math problem ever could. But instead of arguing, he looked at Evan for a long moment, his face calm, but not his eyes. "One day I will build a company so big that people like you will have to rethink everything." With that thought, he turned the page and continued writing. No need to debate. No need to prove himself. Silence could be sharper than words. In his final year at Harvard, Jerome entered a national business strategy competition. His team presented a fuel cost optimization model for airlines, using an algorithm Jerome had developed himself. The judging panel included leaders in aviation and finance. When Jerome finished presenting, the entire room went silent, a silence so heavy it could be felt in his own breath. A CEO asked, "Did you study finance or engineering?" Jerome answered, "Both." Another judge asked, "You came up with this idea yourself?" "I observed from real life," Jerome replied. A simple answer, but a layered one. They didn't know that Jerome's real life included blackout nights in Detroit, long hours in libraries, the scent of old pages stained with forgotten ink, and the quiet nights he stood by his dorm window, watching airplanes take off in the distance. When the competition ended, Jerome's team won by a landslide, and only a few weeks later, he received an admission letter from Harvard Business School, full scholarship. But even with more achievements than he could count, Jerome still felt one thing remained unchanged. The system always tested people like him harder. At a networking event with investment firms, a senior manager looked Jerome up and down and asked, "You study for an MBA, but you want to go into aviation. Not an easy field to break into." "I don't plan to get in," Jerome said. "I plan to change it." The man laughed a polite laugh, but clearly disbelieving. Jerome stayed silent. His words were not bragging. They were a prophecy that would come true years later, when Skylink Air was born and shattered the old limits of the industry. But for now, as Jerome stepped out of the Harvard Hall on a summer afternoon, the breeze lifting his hair, sunlight washing over the red brick path, he felt only one truth: he was no longer trying to escape Detroit. He was moving forward further, stronger, reaching toward the sky he used to watch as a child. And no one, not the doubting teachers, not the mocking students, not the biased recruiters, could imagine that this young man would one day be capable of bringing Pacific Air to its knees with a single phone call. But destiny was approaching, step by step, quietly, unseen, and that was when it was strongest. Jerome Hayes stood in the small temporary office he had rented in Atlanta, the fluorescent lights casting a tired glow on his eyes, red from weeks of sleepless nights. The old wooden desk was buried under sketches, models' notes, and stacks of low-cost aircraft lease contracts. But what truly mattered was the whiteboard in front of him, covered in layers of equations, arrows, charts, and symbols drawn over one another, like a map pointing straight into the future. And that future began in this cramped room. Jerome stared at those markings, which to an outsider looked like chaotic scribbles, but to him formed a complete operational blueprint for a new airline. An airline unlike anything America had ever seen. An airline that would soon make Pacific Air United global, and even the oldest giants nervous. Its name, Skylink Air. The idea had not come from a luxurious boardroom, but from blackout nights in Detroit, where a young boy sat under candlelight, drawing connections between things that seemed unrelated. If an airline reduced cabin cleaning by 5 minutes, if flight routes were designed like a grid, if scheduling was calculated by real demand instead of fixed timetables, if employees were trained under a philosophy of respect rather than obedience. Those ifs combined into a new theory, a quiet revolution. But to bring it into reality, Jerome needed capital people airplanes, and the trust of those who did not trust him. The early days of fundraising were not filled with open conversations or praise. They were filled with skeptical eyes, reluctant handshakes, and polite but empty phrases. Great idea, but too risky. You are too young, not enough experience. Aviation is not an industry for people without a strong background. One investor placed the pitch book on the table as if it weighed twice its actual mass and said, "In 30 years, I have never seen a new airline survive longer than 24 months. Jerome looked him straight in the eye. Then I will be the first." The man laughed a laugh full of pity, but he didn't know Jerome had been hearing that kind of laugh since the days he stood in an Andover classroom, being doubted for solving equations too quickly. Jerome left the meeting and stepped out into the scorching Atlanta heat. But the fire burning inside him was not anger, it was resolve. "If they do not believe, I will make them see." A few weeks later, Jerome found 2 old Embraer 170 aircraft from a regional airline that had just gone bankrupt. The fuselage was scratched, the seats worn, the luggage bins slightly shaky. But they were cheap and, more importantly, enough to begin. Standing inside the empty cabin, staring at the thick layer of dust on the floor, Jerome felt his heartbeat thundering. This was it, the starting point of everything. He placed his hand on the armrest, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. One day aircraft like this will carry my name. But airplanes were only the first step. Jerome needed people. Yet the aviation industry was notorious for cutting flight attendants who were too old technicians, who did not fit the company image, or staff who did not match the brand standards. Those very people became the perfect team for Skylink Air. In his first interview session, a nearly 50-year-old flight attendant, Maria Thompson, looked at Jerome with eyes too tired to hope. "My last airline let me go because they said I no longer fit the brand image." "And what is your image?" Jerome asked. "Someone who has done this job for 25 years and still loves it," she whispered. Jerome smiled. "Then that is exactly the image Skylink needs." The decision spread quickly. Within months, Jerome gathered a team abandoned by other airlines, people with skill experience and a longing to be respected. A group of captains forced into early retirement, a maintenance specialist who once served in the military, a group of young flight attendants rejected for not fitting the so-called ideal look. To the industry, they were rejects. To Jerome, they were the foundation of an empire. On Skylink's first inaugural route, Atlanta to Charlotte, the airline sold only 57% of its seats. No one expected much from a brand new carrier. But at 7:03 in the morning, when Skylink's first aircraft lifted off the runway with a roar, Jerome stood by the airport window, hands clenched into fists. No one knew the man in rolled-up sleeves watching from the terminal was the CEO. No one knew he had spent countless nights calculating every drop of fuel. No one knew that behind that calm expression was a lifetime spent pushing against prejudice. But Jerome knew. And that was enough. As sunlight hit the fuselage, reflecting the fresh paint of the name Skylink Air, Jerome felt his throat tighten. That little aircraft was now proof that people once dismissed could build something an entire industry had to reconsider. But this was only the first chapter. From 2 aircraft, Skylink expanded to 5. From 5 to 12. From 12 to 35. Jerome's fuel optimization algorithm began drawing attention. Airports recorded that Skylink flights were always on time. Passengers called it the airline that respects you. As Skylink soared higher, Jerome was invited to speak at an aviation conference. When he stepped onto the stage, the entire room fell silent. Not because they knew who he was, but because they did not expect someone young black from Detroit to stand in that place. In his speech, Jerome talked about dignity, the core of airline service. Not technology, not strategy, not profit. People are not passengers. They are the center of every decision. A major airline executive whispered to his colleague, "Nice slogan, but not realistic." Yet 6 months later, his airline was forced to overhaul their service model after Skylink took a huge chunk of their market share on 3 key routes. At 37 years old, Jerome, once mocked in Detroit, doubted at Andover, underestimated at Harvard, had become the CEO of the fastest-growing airline in America. But as he stood watching the Skylink fleet lined up on the runway one autumn morning, Jerome knew everything he built was only the lead-up to the biggest challenge of his life. A challenge waiting for him in first-class seat 2A of Pacific Air. A challenge named Catherine Miller. A challenge that seemed small, but would ignite a storm that would bring an entire aviation industry to its knees. Jerome had no idea destiny was already moving toward him, but when it arrived, it would not just change one flight, it would change everything. That morning, the Atlanta sun had barely risen above the horizon, casting a thin, silky layer of light across the glass towers of downtown. But inside Jerome Hayes's penthouse, the only light came from the laptop, displaying the final draft of the biggest deal of his life. The meeting with the Dubai Investment Fund, valued at more than $3.5 billion. A number powerful enough to lift Skylink Air from a rising airline into a global force. At 5:30 in the morning, his phone vibrated when Jerome picked up the voice of Maya Brooks, Skylink's chief operating officer, cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Jerome, you're awake, right? We have new changes from Dubai. They sent over 3 additional market datasets for Southeast Asia last night. I need you to review them immediately. No greeting. No small talk. That was Maya. A strategic mind, a 37-year-old black woman, sharp as steel, who had been with Jerome since the days Skylink had only 2 aircraft. Jerome opened the file while responding. I'm looking at it now. The Seoul Singapore segment needs an updated fuel cost projection. Did Carter send anything else? Maya let out a small laugh, edged with sarcasm. Devin called me at 3 in the morning. He said if Dubai makes one more change, he's flying over there himself and bringing sleeping pills. Devin Carter, Skylink's chief financial officer, 41 years old, a finance prodigy whose eyes always seemed half asleep, but whose calculations hit every cent with precision. Jerome chuckled a short sound that eased the tension in the room. Tell Devin I need him awake for one more day, Jerome said. Tomorrow we close this deal. No mistakes allowed. But when he hung up, he knew this deal was not just about money. It was the launch pad for Skylink's international expansion entry into major markets, and more importantly, the final step in solidifying Skylink's place as the most progressive airline in America. And as with every important moment of his life, this would not come easy. At 7 o'clock, Jerome finished his usual breakfast oats, egg whites and black coffee. Simple, fast, no unnecessary emotion. He put on a dark cardigan, wore glasses instead of contacts, and chose jeans over a suit because today he would fly on Pacific Air as a regular passenger. No CEO, no spotlight. Just a black man walking into first class with a modest leather bag, and that always produced interesting reactions. Jerome liked this, not because he enjoyed being underestimated, but because how people treated him when they didn't know who he was always revealed the purest data. Unfiltered information, and Pacific Air, an old airline, confident to the point of arrogance, was the perfect subject. At the Atlanta airport, when Jerome stepped up to the priority check-in counter, the agent glanced at him once and said nothing except boarding pass. ID. No smile, no warm greeting like the ones offered to white businessmen in tailored suits. As expected, Jerome thought. Observe and note. He entered the first-class lounge, chose a quiet corner, and reviewed the Dubai documents once more. While studying the charts, his phone buzzed again. Devon. Jerome Devon's voice still carried the haze of exhaustion. Dubai wants to add more attendees to the meeting. 2 aviation consultants and a nephew of theirs. He's obsessed with airplanes. Obsessed with airplanes, Jerome repeated. Good. Might be easier to talk to someone passionate about planes than someone only passionate about money. Devon laughed. I'll send you their profiles. Oh, and by the way, I'm on the flight to New York now. The meeting room is set. Tech team is reinstalling the presentation system. Good, Jerome said. We cannot afford any sloppy details. But as he hung up, a ripple of unease passed through him. A deal this large meant that even the smallest disruption could ruin everything, and Jerome Hayes always sensed trouble before it arrived. When the boarding announcement chime rang, Jerome gathered his documents, slung his bag, and headed toward the gate. Pacific Air Flight 761 to New York. First class. Seat 2A. A seat he selected for the clear view, the privacy and the distance from the aisle that allowed him to work without distraction. He gently placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, opened his laptop. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Maya Jerome Dubai sent the final revision. Call before takeoff. He stood, stepped off the aircraft onto the jet bridge to get better reception, and took the call. The conversation lasted longer than expected. Maya spoke fast, listing every change Dubai had made, every new requirement, every shift in the agreement. When Jerome returned to first class, everything had changed, and changed in a way that sent a deep, heavy thud through his chest like a warning drumbeat. Seat 2A, his seat now, had someone sitting in it, a blonde woman around 50 years old wearing an expensive blazer and a silk scarf, and next to her in seat 2B sat Jerome's bag and documents, moved, removed, without explanation, without permission, without hesitation. And she did not even look at him. Not one glance, not one word, just a single action, the kind he had encountered thousands of times across his life, from Detroit to Harvard, from conference rooms to crowded terminals, a quiet display of contempt wrapped in civility. He stood still for 2 seconds, not angry, not shocked, just silent. Silent as if he had just recognized the final missing piece of a familiar equation. And then that stolen first-class seat would ignite the greatest upheaval in the history of American aviation. But the woman sitting there, Catherine Miller, had no idea. She did not know that Jerome Hayes, the man she deemed unworthy of a second look, was standing right in front of her. She did not know the real power of the person she assumed was just a passenger in the wrong cabin, and she definitely did not know that her small act of arrogance would make Pacific Air pay in less than 48 hours. Jerome took a long breath. It had begun, and he understood from this point on nothing would ever be the same. As Jerome stepped 1 pace deeper into the first-class cabin, the noise from the passengers behind him seemed to fade away. In that moment, the entire cabin felt as though it had tightened into a small stage, and he, a man who had learned to stand still under every prejudiced stare. Life had thrown at him, was preparing to face a performance all too familiar, yet carrying the scent of danger. Seat 2A was still occupied, and Catherine Miller continued scrolling through her phone as if the space around her belonged solely to her. When Jerome spoke, his voice was low, calm, but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Excuse me. I believe you are sitting in my seat." Catherine looked up for half a second. Her expression, a blend of annoyance, confusion, and evaluation, Her eyes slid across the dark jeans, the simple cardigan, the unbranded leather bag. Then her gaze narrowed as if she had reached her conclusion. Not important. Not equal. She replied, her voice flat and cold. No, this is my seat. Jerome kept his tone polite. My ticket is for 2A, and these are my belongings. He pointed at the stack of papers that had been pushed to seat 2B. A moment of silence followed, but it did not belong to Catherine. It belonged to the watching passengers, the ones just beginning to pay attention. Catherine did not waver. She placed a hand on her chest and inhaled dramatically, as if Jerome had committed some profound offense. I have a fear of sitting near the aisle. I always take the window. Pacific Air always prioritizes me. One sentence filled with entitlement and arrogance. Jerome glanced at the ticket sitting beside her. 2B aisle. Clear. Undeniable. I understand, Jerome said softly, but this is still my seat. Catherine gave a thin smile, the kind worn by people accustomed to giving orders. You can sit over there. It's not going to ruin your life. That phrase, it's not going to ruin your life, passed through Jerome's ears like an old blade, familiar but still capable of cutting. It's not going to ruin your life. He had heard variations of that sentence from teachers, wealthy classmates, biased recruiters from people who looked at him and believed his worth was defined by money, a suit, or his skin. He did not react. He did not show emotion. His silence sharpened the air around him. Is there a problem here? A flight attendant's voice called out. Her badge read, Amber Sullivan. Her eyes went straight to Catherine, following a path carved by habit and bias, the path of prioritization. Mrs. Miller, is everything all right? Amber asked, as though Jerome was nothing more than background sound. Catherine immediately shifted into a tone of victimhood. I just need the window seat. But this man is making it difficult for me. Amber turned to Jerome with a look that held suspicion. So may I see your ticket? Jerome handed it over. Amber glanced at it and froze for a split second. You are assigned to 2A, but instead of asking Catherine to return the seat, Amber lowered her voice. Would you mind sitting in 2B for now, because of Mrs. Miller's health condition? Jerome asked, health condition. Catherine frowned. I have medical documentation, but she did not show it. Amber faced Jerome again, her tone softening into gentle coercion. Please understand. A passenger behind them, an older man, frowned at the scene. A black woman in row 4 gave Jerome a knowing look, the look of someone who had lived this pattern too many times. Jerome knew he was standing at a crossroads. Argue, and he would become the disruptive passenger. Yield, and he would be dismissed even further. Both were traps. But what Catherine and Amber did not know was that Jerome was no longer the Harvard student he had been 20 years earlier. He was the CEO of Skylink Air, a man who had the power to cost Pacific Air billions. But they didn't know, and that ignorance was what made Jerome unnervingly calm. All right, he said. I will sit in 2B. Both Catherine and Amber exhaled in relief, as if they had won a small battle, a battle whose true danger they did not understand. As Jerome lowered himself into seat 2B, Catherine leaned toward the passenger in front of her and said loudly enough for the cabin to hear, People like that should know their place. Why would he need a window seat anyway? A small laugh echoed from the business cabin behind them. Amber pretended not to hear, but Jerome heard, and for the first time in months, he felt a heat rising up his neck. Not anger. Activation. When the flight supervisor approached Daniel Fletcher, Jerome already knew exactly what would happen next, and right on cue, Sir Daniel said to ensure a smooth, first-class experience for our premium customers, we recommend moving you to economy comfort. The seat is a bit wider than standard economy, from first class to economy comfort. Jerome looked straight into Daniel's eyes. He said nothing, no reaction, no argument. A passenger behind them muttered, "Why would you do that? The seat clearly belongs to him." Daniel ignored it. Catherine smirked. Amber avoided eye contact, and Jerome understood Pacific Air had just stepped directly into a massive trap, one of their own making. A trap only the arrogant fail to see. "All right," Jerome said for the second time. One word, light as air. But its consequences would be a hurricane. He rose, gathered his documents, and stepped past Catherine. As he walked by, Catherine whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Good. Knowing your place is smart." Jerome did not look at her. He did not reply. But inside him, a door quietly opened. Not a door to anger. A door to strategy. Because what Catherine didn't know was that the man she had just humiliated had the power to reshape the entire aviation industry. And Catherine Miller had just signed Pacific Air's sentence. Jerome walked to economy comfort, sat in the narrower seat with the firmer cushion and the smaller space. But for him, this was not an insult. It was the spark. And only someone with true discipline knows how to turn a slap into a sentence for an entire empire. Jerome leaned back, opened his laptop and began to write. Not the Dubai presentation. A full counter-strike plan. A plan Pacific Air would never be ready for. A plan that would turn Seat 2A into the biggest corporate misstep in recent memory. Only one person in the cabin knew a storm was forming, the person creating it. Jerome Hayes lifted his head, his eyes sharp as a blade. It had begun. Pacific Air would remember his name. The moment Jerome leaned back into the cramped economy comfort seat, the cabin seemed to shrink until only 3 things remained. The screen in front of him, the steady hum of the engines, and the slow, deep rhythm of his own heartbeat, coiled tight like a creature preparing to break free from its cage. 34 years of his life had conditioned him to endure insults wrapped in polite facades. But this time something felt different. Not because he had been pushed out of first class. Not because of Catherine Miller, but because he was on his way to the most important meeting in the history of Skylink Air. And Pacific Air had chosen the worst possible moment to underestimate him. If they thought he would swallow this quietly, like thousands of passengers who had endured similar humiliation, they were about to prove how badly they had misjudged their target. The plane trembled gently as it lifted off the runway, and the instant the wheels left the ground, Jerome opened his laptop. A blank email page appeared. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. But instead of writing a message filled with anger, he typed exactly 7 words, capable of triggering a full-scale corporate war. "We need to discuss a new strategy." He sent the email to Maya and Devon. No explanation, no details, just a signal. A signal that the 2 people who had been by his side for 10 years understood perfectly Jerome was not angry. Jerome was calculating. Maya replied in exactly 3 minutes. "What happened? Call me the moment you land." Devon replied in 1 minute. "Another incident on a flight." Jerome said nothing. He never let emotion steer him. But his hand tightened around the armrest. Because he knew the most dangerous enemy is never the one who shouts, but the one who thinks silently. When the plane reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants began serving drinks. In theory, if a first-class passenger was demoted to economy comfort, they would still receive first-class refreshments as a gesture of appeasement. But when Amber walked past Jerome's row with a tray of drinks in hand, she moved right past him as if he were invisible. Not a question, not a glance, not even the minimum acknowledgement. The passenger beside Jerome frowned and whispered, "That's the first-class attendant, right? Shouldn't you?" Jerome smiled faintly. "It's fine." But it was not fine. It was a note, a small but important piece of data, another tile in a growing mosaic he had been assembling ever since Catherine shoved his belongings to seat 2B. Nearly 1 hour passed, but Jerome did not review the Dubai documents as planned. He was stuck on a single thought, a thought that began the moment Catherine opened her mouth. "Pacific Air always prioritizes me." That statement was not entirely true, or at least not true in the simple customer service sense. But if it had another meaning, a meaning tied to influence money or corporate alliances, Jerome opened his browser. The network was weak but enough to search. He typed Catherine Miller, Pacific Air. Results appeared in 0.6 seconds, and the answer made Jerome lean forward slightly, like he had just seen a missing puzzle piece snap into place. Catherine Miller, Sr., Vice President of Client Relations, Meridian Holdings. Meridian Holdings, one of the largest investment groups in the country. And more importantly, Meridian had just entered a strategic partnership with United Global Airways, the airline, competing for the same Dubai deal Skylink was pursuing. Jerome's breathing grew heavier. A thin layer of clarity settled over his vision. Not exhaustion, calculation. When he pieced it together, Catherine worked for Meridian. Meridian was supporting United Global Skylink's direct competitor. Jerome was flying to New York for the Dubai meeting, and Catherine just happened to be in the same first-class cabin. There is no such thing as coincidence when big money is involved. Maybe she did not recognize him at first. But once Amber referred to him as this man, once Catherine saw his face clearly, once she realized who he was, she escalated immediately, pressuring the flight attendant, fabricating a medical issue, suggesting a seat downgrade, even demanding his ticket be rechecked. Not because of the seat, not because of the window, but because of a much larger objective delay, rattle him, disrupt his preparation, or worst of all, get him labeled as a disruptive passenger and removed from the flight entirely. It was a classic financial warfare tactic: waste your opponent's time. But Catherine made one fatal mistake. Jerome was not the kind of man who fell to petty tricks. He opened a new email draft and typed the subject line, Phase 1, Rapid Disruption Plan. The body listed 18 actions Skylink could execute within 48 hours to attack Pacific Air's market without violating a single regulation. Some of them included increasing flight frequency on Pacific's monopolized routes, purchasing airport slots, pending renewal freezing code share, partnerships launching a sudden low-fare blitz, boosting the PR team to track media trends, actions that every airline CIO feared if they came from a competitor. Jerome looked at the draft, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. He knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly whom he was about to hit. As the plane prepared to descend, a message from Maya popped up on his screen. "Jerome, are you okay? I have a bad feeling something happened." Jerome glanced toward the front of the cabin where Catherine adjusted her hair, her lips curling into a small, victorious smile. The smile of someone who believed she had handled an unimportant nuisance. But she didn't know. None of them knew that the man they had dismissed was someone capable of shaking Pacific Air's stock price with a single well-timed remark. Jerome replied to Maya with one sentence: "Prepare for an emergency meeting the moment I reach the New York office. Activate Plan B." Maya responded seconds later. Which Plan B? Jerome looked at Catherine one last time, his eyes cold, sharp, precise. The Plan B we never wanted to use. The plane touched down with a firm jolt, a jolt that marked the beginning of a war. Pacific Air had no idea what kind of force they had awakened, but they would learn. In the next 48 hours, they would learn very clearly, and Jerome Hayes would make sure they never forgot. When the aircraft rolled into the gate, Jerome remained seated for a few extra seconds. Not because he needed to gather his things, but because he was letting the compressed anger inside him settle, not explode, into something sharper than any outburst could ever be strategic intent. Other passengers stood up, reached for carry-ons, chatted about New York weather. But Jerome heard nothing except the slow, deliberate rhythm of his pulse, each beat reminding him this is not just about a seat. This is about dignity, about rivals, about prejudice, about war. As passengers filed out, Catherine Miller walked past him, both hands gripping her jewelry-laden Hermes bag. Her eyes drifted over him, the way someone might glance at something of no value. She smiled, a small, triumphant, icy smile. Jerome simply tilted his head. No words, no reaction, no need, because she had no idea that the smile she just gave him would become the final crease in the downfall of her own career. When the cabin finally cleared, Jerome rose. He adjusted his collar, fixed the strap of his watch, and walked forward. A man in a Pacific Air uniform waited near the cockpit door, Daniel Fletcher, the flight supervisor. Daniel's face tightened into a forced, uneasy smile the moment he saw Jerome clinging to politeness as if it were his last lifeline. "Mr. Hayes, I hope your new seat was more comfortable." The sentence landed like a misplaced punch. Very misplaced. Jerome looked directly into Daniel's eyes. Slow, clear, not angry. Just cold. "We need to talk." Daniel flinched at the tone. A tone not loud, not harsh, but carrying weight that made him unconsciously stand up straighter. "Of course, do you want me to process a refund voucher?" Jerome reached into his wallet. He pulled out a matte black card, nothing printed on it, except 3 thin silver words. Jerome Hayes, Chief Executive Officer, Skylink Air. Daniel stared at the card. His face drained from pink to white in half a second. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I believe Jerome said quietly, "You now understand the magnitude of today's mistake." A flight attendant walked by, heard the words, "Chief Executive Officer Skylink," and her eyes widened as if she had seen a ghost. Every sentence spoken in that cabin, "People like you, this seat doesn't suit you." You're being difficult, played back in their minds, like a slow-motion reel. Jerome continued, "I will be contacting Pacific Air headquarters." And when they called back to investigate what happened, he paused long enough to make Daniel feel the full weight of what was coming. "You should be prepared to explain why you denied a passenger's rightful seat, violated seat reassignment policy, and demonstrated preferential bias." Daniel's face turned pale. "Mr. Hayes, I had no idea you were." That Jerome cut in is the problem. One pause, one breath, one final sentence. Integrity doesn't depend on who is standing in front of you. Then Jerome walked away. No glance back. No need. As he stepped off the aircraft, the 2 pilots stood at the door greeting passengers. But the moment they saw the card trembling in Daniel's hand, Both pilots froze. Captain Chambers, who had witnessed pieces of the chaos from the cockpit, frowned slightly. "Mr. Hayes, we sincerely apologize for any inconvenience." "You did not create it," Jerome replied, "but your headquarters will have to answer for it." The captain swallowed. "I will document everything in the flight report." "Good," Jerome said. And he walked out. A few passengers waiting on the jet bridge recognized his face, not because of fame, but because they had witnessed the composure he held in a situation where most people would have erupted. A middle-aged white man nodded at him. "You handled that with incredible poise." A woman murmured, "The way they treated you was awful. No one deserves that." Jerome answered only with a small smile, a smile that did not reach his eyes, because in his mind a massive gear had just begun to turn. As soon as Jerome entered the terminal, his phone vibrated non-stop. 5 missed calls from Maya, 3 from Devon, messages from the internal public relations team, and an unknown number, but the area code belonged to Pacific Air headquarters. He did not answer any of them. Instead, he sent one text to the internal group with Maya and Devon at the office in 50 minutes. "Prepare the strategy room." "Emergency," Maya replied instantly. "What happened?" "Devon, are we activating Plan C or Plan D?" Jerome stared at the blinking cursor, then typed Plan H. Maya immediately tried calling. Jerome did not answer. Plan H. In the 10 years of Skylink's existence, Plan H had appeared only once on paper. It had never been used, never been spoken aloud. The H stood for Hayes Offensive, a plan designed not for defense, but for a full-scale corporate strike when a competitor displayed systemic disrespect. And today, Pacific Air had activated it. When Jerome entered the car of his private driver, he slid into the back seat and fastened his belt. "To Midtown office as usual, sir?" the driver asked. Jerome looked out toward the distant runway where the Pacific Air aircraft was being towed away. "Yes, and as fast as possible." The car sped forward. His phone rang again, an unfamiliar number. He looked. Only one line appeared on the screen. P. Reynolds Pacific Air, the National Director of Customer Service, calling. Not waiting, not hesitating, not questioning who was on the other end. Jerome knew the longer he made Pacific Air wait, the more nervous they would become, and the more nervous they were, the more mistakes they would make. He let the phone ring. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then he pressed decline. They will call back. He checked the time. 2 hours until the Dubai meeting. 1 hour to stabilize his team. And in the next 48 hours, he would make Pacific Air feel the cost of arrogance. But above all, he would make one truth unmistakably clear. No person, no airline, no system has the right to strip anyone of their dignity. They had forgotten that. But Jerome Hayes would remind them in a way they would never expect. The New York sky opened in front of him. The war began. Slowly, quietly. But when it ignited, it would burn through an entire empire. Pacific Air had chosen the wrong man to provoke, and now they would learn the greatest lesson in aviation history. They would learn it from a passenger pushed into economy, but the wrong passenger. At the wrong time. Completely wrong. Jerome closed his eyes. Let's begin. The black Skylink sedan screeched to a stop in front of the glass tower, its tires grinding against the concrete with a sharp sound that felt like a warning of something about to break. The door swung open, and Jerome Hayes stepped out, his face calm to the point of coldness, but his eyes carrying a storm, compressed beneath a still surface. No one in the lobby knew that only 45 minutes earlier This man had been humiliated on a rival airline's flight. No one knew he had been pushed out of first class. No one knew he had been treated as someone unworthy of the seat he had paid for. But they were about to know. Very soon. Because what Pacific Air had touched was not his pride, but his dignity, and dignity was something Jerome would protect at any cost. He strode toward the elevator, each step pushing his resolve higher. The Skylink building glowed bright, and employees passing by bowed their heads with the familiar respect. But today, Jerome saw no one. No stray thoughts, no distractions, only purpose. When the elevator doors opened on the 43rd floor, the level reserved for high-level strategy, Maya Brooks was already waiting, arms crossed, eyes sharp and worried. Devin Carter stood beside her laptop, open and filled with data windows. Both straightened the moment Jerome appeared. The tension in the room was so thick, it had a sound. "Tell us," Maya said first. Direct, fast, precise, exactly who she was. What happened? Jerome set his bag on the table, adjusted his collar, and spoke in a voice low but fully controlled. Pacific Air made a grave mistake. Devin raised an eyebrow. Grave enough for you to trigger level H. Jerome looked at them, his eyes so sharp, it felt like the whole room tightened. Not just grave, systemic, intentional, and tied to our competitors. Then he recounted everything. No exaggeration, no softening. From the moment he returned to seat 2A, to the look in Catherine's eyes, to Amber's tone, as if Jerome were the problem, to Daniel's suggestion that he move to economy comfort. All of it. But the moment that made Maya and Devin's faces change was when Jerome placed his phone on the table and said, "Catherine Miller, Vice President of Meridian Holdings." Devin shot up from his chair like a gun had gone off next to his ear. No way. Meridian. The main partner of United Global, the same competitor fighting us for the Dubai fund. Maya tightened her grip on a helmet sitting on the table, her eyes widening. "Are you saying she took part in this on purpose?" Jerome shook his head. "Not certain. But I know this: she recognized me, very quickly. And after that, every one of her actions shifted." Maya exhaled hard. "Jerome, if this is real, United Global might be playing dirty." "No," Jerome said, his voice dropping lower. "They already played dirty." Silence swallowed the room. Heavy metallic silence. Devin broke it. So the plan. Jerome turned, pressed a button on the large screen. A document appeared. Hayes Offensive, 48-hour counter-strategy draft. Maya's eyes widened. Devin let out a quiet whistle. Then, one by one, the strategic strikes appeared, each one aimed precisely at Pacific Air's weak points. One purchase every airport slot. Pacific Air has expiring today to suspend all code-share agreements. Pacific relies on 3 Adjust Skylink's routes to drain their customer flow in 3 key markets. 4 block Pacific's approach to the Dubai organization by filing a report for customer integrity violation. 5. Activate the public relations monitoring team. 6. Prepare a legal file to review the crew's violations. 7. Prepare a press briefing. If Pacific retaliates, 8. Activate Skylink Loyalty Boost to pull passengers from Pacific within 24 hours. 9. Create a quiet media wave, positioning Skylink as the most respectful airline in America. When the list ended, Maya whispered, "Jerome, this isn't a response. I know. This is a war." Jerome met her eyes, and I did not start it. Pacific Air did. Devin leaned over the table, his tone serious. "I don't oppose this, but you need to understand something. If we hit too hard, they will retaliate. It could lead to legal escalation. It could affect the Dubai deal." Jerome tilted his head. "Devin, Do you really think Dubai wants to partner with a company too weak to defend the dignity of its own chief executive officer? Devon fell silent. Maya answered instead. Powerful investors don't fear storms, they trust the people who can create storms. Jerome nodded. Exactly. He placed both hands on the table, his voice sinking to a deeper, heavier tone. Pacific Air thinks I will stay quiet. They think because I wasn't wearing a suit, because I wasn't carrying a $50,000 watch, because I didn't fly private today. They think I will endure it. A pause. They all waited, but they were wrong. Completely wrong. Maya stepped closer, narrowing her eyes. I need to ask you something. Not because I doubt you, but because I need to hear you say it. Jerome raised an eyebrow. Ask. Maya asked, Are you doing this out of emotion or out of principle? A blade-sharp question. But Jerome did not flinch. He stood straighter and said each word, as if placing weight onto the ground. I'm doing this for principle. His hands tightened slightly, the knuckles whitening. If I allow them to treat me this way, someone with power, how many people with no power will be treated 10 times worse, 100 times worse? Devon bowed his head, not out of fear, but out of respect. Maya held Jerome's gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, as if sealing a decision long-forming. Then I stand with you. Devon smirked. And I'll go check the slot market. God Pacific is going to panic. They were about to leave the room when Maya paused and asked Jerome, What's the first move of the campaign? Jerome looked out the glass wall at the glowing grid of New York, a living network of power money and ambition. Then he spoke, his voice calm to the point of coldness, each word sharp as a blade. First step, make Pacific Air. Understand they picked the wrong man. No explosion, no raised voice, just a declaration. But it carried the weight of a rising storm, and that storm had only just begun. The Skylink black sedan screeched to a halt in front of the glass tower, its tires grinding against the concrete with a sharp sound that felt like a warning that something was about to break. The door swung open, and Jerome Hayes stepped out, his expression calm to the point of coldness, but his eyes carrying the weight of a storm held beneath a perfectly still surface. No one in the lobby knew that only 45 minutes earlier, this man had been humiliated on a rival airline's flight. No one knew he had been pushed out of first class. No one knew he had been treated as someone unworthy of the seat he had paid for. But they were about to know. Soon. Because what Pacific Air touched was not his ego, but his dignity. And dignity was something Jerome would defend at any cost. He strode toward the elevator, each step driving his determination higher. The Skylink building glowed with bright lights. Employees passing by greeted him with the familiar respect they always had. But today, Jerome saw no one. No stray thoughts, no diversions, only purpose. When the elevator opened onto the 43rd floor, the high-level strategic tier Maya Brooks was already waiting, arms crossed, eyes sharp with worry and fire. Devon Carter stood beside her laptop, open and filled with data screens. Both straightened the moment Jerome appeared. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it hummed. Tell us, Maya said first, fast, direct, precise. What happened? Jerome set his bag down, adjusted his collar, and spoke in a voice low but absolutely steady. Pacific Air made a serious mistake. Devon raised an eyebrow. Serious enough for you to call level H? Jerome looked at them, his gaze so sharp it seemed to pull the entire room taut. Not just serious, systemic, intentional, and connected to our competitors. Then he told them everything. No exaggeration, no omissions. From the moment he returned to seat 2A, to the look in Catherine's eyes, to Amber's tone, treating him like the problem, to Daniel's suggestion that he be moved to economy comfort. All of it. But the moment that made Maya and Devin's expressions shift was when Jerome set his phone on the table and said, "Catherine Miller, Vice President of Meridian Holdings." Devin shot upright, as if a gun had gone off beside him. Impossible. Meridian, the primary partner of United Global, the same competitor trying to win Dubai away from us. Maya's hands clenched the edge of the table, her eyes wide. "You think she did this intentionally?" Jerome shook his head. "Not sure. But I know this, she recognized me. Very quickly. And after that, every part of her behavior changed." Maya exhaled hard. "Jerome, if this is real, United Global is plain dirty?" "No," Jerome said quietly. "They already did." The room sank into silence. Heavy. Metallic. Devin broke it first, so the plan Jerome turned pressed a button on the large screen. A document appeared. Hayes Offensive. 48-hour counter-strategy draft. Maya's eyes widened. Devin let out a low whistle. Then one by one the strategic strikes appeared, each one aimed precisely at Pacific Air's vital arteries. One purchase every airport slot. Pacific has expiring today. 2 suspend all code share agreements. Pacific relies on 3 reroute. Skylink flights to drain Pacific's customer flow in 3 major markets. 4 block Pacific from approaching the Dubai organization by filing an official report for customer integrity violation. 5. Activate the public relations monitoring team. 6. Prepare a legal case to investigate crew misconduct. 7. Prepare a press briefing. In case Pacific retaliates. 8. Activate the Skylink loyalty boost to pull passengers from Pacific within 24 hours. 9. Quietly signal to media outlets that Skylink is the most respectful airline in America. When the list ended, Maya whispered, "Jerome, this isn't a reaction. I know, this is a war." Jerome held her gaze, and I didn't start it. Pacific Air did. Devin leaned forward, voice low. "I'm not against it. But you have to understand, if we hit too hard, they'll hit back. Legal moves, smear campaigns. It could jeopardize Dubai." Jerome tilted his head. "Devin, do you really think Dubai wants to partner with a company too weak to defend the dignity of its own chief executive officer?" Devin fell silent. Maya answered instead. "Powerful investors don't fear storms. They trust the ones who know how to create storms." Jerome nodded. "Exactly." He placed both hands on the table, his voice dropping into something heavier, something decisive. "Pacific Air thinks I'll stay quiet. They think because I wasn't wearing a suit, because I wasn't wearing a $50,000 watch, because I didn't fly private today. They think I'll endure it." A pause. Everyone watched him. But they were wrong. Completely wrong. Maya stepped closer, studying him. "I need to ask this. Not because I doubt you, but because I need to hear the answer from you." Jerome raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Maya asked. "Are you doing this out of emotion or out of principle?" A question sharp enough to cut. But Jerome did not waver. He straightened each word, falling like a weight. "I am doing this for principle." His hand curled slightly, knuckles whitening. "If I allow them to treat me this way, someone with power, how many people without power, will be treated 10 times worse, 100 times worse?" Devin lowered his head, not from fear, but respect. Maya looked at Jerome for a long moment, then nodded like someone sealing a decision that had finally matured. "Then I stand with you," Devin chuckled. "And I'll go grab those slots. God help Pacific Air. They were about to leave when Maya turned back. Jerome. What is the first move? Jerome looked out the tall glass windows at the glowing web of Manhattan's lights, a living network of power, ambition, and consequence. Then he spoke calm as ice, but sharp as a blade. First step, make Pacific Air. Understand they picked the wrong man. No yelling. No dramatic flair. Just a declaration. But it carried the weight of a storm rising, and that storm had only begun. In that night, as airports across America dimmed their lights, Jerome Hayes, the man, shoved out of seat 2A, initiated a counterstrike that would shake the entire aviation industry within 48 hours. The war had begun, and there was no turning back. Jerome stepped out of the operations room, leaving behind a sentence that would chill Pacific Air to its core when they heard it the next morning. They did not take my seat. They picked the wrong man. From the perspective of management experts and sociologists, Jerome Hayes's story reveals a sharp and undeniable truth within large systems. Sometimes, a single moment of disrespect is enough to expose deep fractures beneath the surface. What sets Jerome apart is not the authority of a chief executive officer, but his ability to turn an insult into the driving force that reshapes an entire industry. He did not strike back out of ego, but acted to defend a principle that human dignity is not negotiable, and disrespect must carry consequences. If this story made you reflect on how we treat one another, make sure to like and subscribe, so you do not miss the powerful awakening journeys ahead. And before you leave, share a short comment. Keep respect.